If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs of seen as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori.
It's fairly certain that Gray did say when the war broke out that the lights are going out all over Europe and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. The First World War was, in the words of George Kennan, the American diplomat, a seminal catastrophe for Europe, and I think the most important event in the 20th century.
The financial crisis of the summer of 1914 was the most severe financial crisis that London has ever experienced, and all this was happening as the nation was teetering on the brink of war.
What the First World War does is it brings psychiatry into mainstream medicine, and it gets doctors to think about psychological disorders as a branch of mainstream medicine.
A global event of this nature isn't going to go away. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of our history as individuals, of the history of our societies in the 20th century, and of the history of the world.
There's no doubt that the Allies won the war, that Germany was defeated and the military panicked and told the Kaiser he had to make peace. Though later on the military blamed the left wing in Germany, the famous stab in the back legend, for losing the war. But part of the difficulty was that many Germans did not believe they'd lost the war, and of course all that helped the legends which brought Hitler to power. So you may argue that it was an incomplete end to the First World War, and that Germany would be intent, when she was strong enough, to gain her revenge. And from that point of view, as I said earlier, the Second World War in some sense was a consequence of the First.
I think in hindsight the Allies should have kept going. I think they should have gone on and crushed Germany. Why? Because in some ways that was the only way to drive home to the German people and the German Empire, the German leadership, that they had been defeated. The problem is that Germany is defeated on the battlefield in 1918, or is at the point of collapse. But she does not suffer that collapse, which means that you can carry on in the 1920s with a myth of being stabbed in the back or betrayed, or perhaps we hadn't lost the war, perhaps we had been sold short by our leaders. So of course it brings that idea about whether the Germans had actually been defeated as a difficult question for the Allies to answer.
The issue that you get in 1918 is there are different sorts of pieces that are being championed by different elements of society by this point. And ironically, of course, when you start to make peace in Paris after the war, there's a contest over the form of the peace, and you don't really achieve any one of these sorts of pieces. You're left with a very poor peace settlement and the roots for future conflict, domestic conflict, well into the 20s, which will break out again in the 30s, and ultimately, as we know, a Second World War.
As Foreign Secretary, Gray was obviously an important figure, but perhaps a less important figure than some of his critics have suggested. Some people have gone so far as to say, I mean, Max Hastings, for example, is one, the reason Britain entered the war is due to one man only, and that was Edward Grey. And I think that view is absurd. No British government could go to war in 1914 without the support of Parliament and without the support of public opinion. And I think that tends to distinguish Britain from the other states involved in the war, that we were the only state really that had a system of responsible government, namely a government responsible to Parliament. That required a two-block party system, which we had. The French had a group system of politics, a multi-party system, which made it very difficult to secure responsibility. Whereas in the empires of Germany and Austria and Russia, there was no real parliamentary responsibility at all, and the governments were as responsible to the emperors of those countries as much as they were to parliaments. And this had a very crucial effect which wasn't there in Britain, and namely that the military had much more leeway in those countries than they did in Britain, where they were firmly under civilian control. So I think the answer to the question about Edward Grey is that he had obviously a great deal of influence and power, but not as much as his critics suggested, and he could not have taken Britain into war without the solid approval of the cabinet, of his party, and I think of the country.
I think the causes of the First World War have been a favourite subject for historians for decades now. There have been many books written on it. In this particular instance, we can look at German nationalism in Austria and say, yes, this was part of a wider national conflict that was causing resentment within the empire. But it's the military that start the war. It's the Chief of the General Staff who pushes for the rejection of any Serbian offer to mediate. And what you have in Europe at the time are two large power blocks that are very finely balanced, but also just waiting for a spark for war to begin. And the fact that the war goes on for 4 years shows how well balanced those power blocks were. And it's only when you get the intervention of an external element, the United States, that the power blocks finally topple over and we can see an end to the war.
There was an expectation when the war began that it would be short, that the phrase "it'll be all over by Christmas" tended to be bandied around, but nobody really, I think, believed that, certainly among the military leadership. Military plans were predicated on the hope that, yes, there could be a quick end to the war, because there was a realisation if there was not a quick end, it was going to be a long, difficult, costly war. In the first phase of the war in 1914, in fact, popular enthusiasm, if not present when war broke out, was quickly engaged, essentially because it was a response to what was taking place on the battlefield. When armies clashed, when you could see the nature of and the impact of war on civilian populations, it roused people to support their armies, their armed forces. It strengthened their belief in the legitimacy of what they were actually doing.
Well, there were many different reasons why people decided to join up in the First World War. Lots of them combined within one person. So you would often get people who would want to join up for economic reasons. You might have people joining up for a sense of adventure because they found their lives boring at the time and they thought war offered an opportunity to do something different. You might have people who felt the peer pressure and felt that they really had no choice and had to sign up. But I think one of the really crucial things to think about is the fact that many people signed up because they felt they needed to protect their homes and families. And that really is something that I think we need to think about when we're thinking about recruitment.
Shell shock was a rather blanket term, to be honest, that was invented in 1915 to describe various manifestations that were affecting men at war. It was around tremors, shaking attacks, fits, unexplained symptoms, blindness, deafness, all sorts of really quite strange symptoms that were brought together under this new term, shell shock.
Shell shock has a variety of causes. It can be the soldier who's been in the trench for 6 months, 9 months, who just can't cope anymore. It can be somebody who's got a history of mental illness, who's inadequately trained and thrown into the middle of a battle without all the defences that they need. So it covers a range of presentations, from the determined regular soldier who's just been worn out by battle to somebody who just hasn't had the correct preparation and has been sent over to France with very minimal training and no real experience of the military. A lot of soldiers were discharged from the army in 1915 and 16 in an uncured state. Because doctors didn't know quite what they were dealing with, they couldn't get the men better, so they couldn't return them to active duty. So they were discharged, and then they struggled to accommodate themselves in civilian life. And a lot of these veterans never recover in the interwar period. They continue to suffer from headaches, tremor, nightmares, all those core features of shell shock. And because of that, they're not very employable. And some of them do manage to get a war pension, which just about keeps them alive. during the 1920s and 30s.
Shell shock is a term that really should only be used for the First World War. It's a very specific thing. It captures the damage that the shell was doing to the body, to the mind, indeed to the whole of culture and society. At the end of the war, actually, it disappeared from medical use and it disappeared from military use. But of course, it's very much now in the language. So, you know, this morning, someone will have been described in the news, no matter when you show this film, as being the Prime Minister is shell-shocked, or a football team manager is described as shell-shocked. So we all know what that means. But back then it meant something different.
Today we wouldn't call it shell shock. They would be called medically unexplained symptoms. And a few years ago there was a very puzzling disorder which was popularly known as Gulf War syndrome. And many of those presentations seen in veterans of the First Gulf War were akin to the shell shock patients of the First World War.
War has always been a big stimulus to medicine. And by the end of the war, the Royal Army Medical Corps has 160,000 doctors working for them. And some of them are working here at the Maudsley. And it becomes a centre of expertise in psychiatry, and many of the people who will go on to dominate post-war psychiatry come here. And there's a famous picture, and they gathered here at the Maudsley for a conference to talk about what have been the lessons of shell shock, what was it, and how should it be treated. So even then, back then, the Maudsley once again was the centre of British psychiatry and attracting the best in psychiatry, as of course it still does.
King's College London during the First World War very much was an institution that played its part in Britain's war effort, and as an academic I'm curious to find out exactly what role a university would have played when the society that it represented went to war.
The college was hugely involved actually in the First World War in all sorts of different ways. About 1,600 staff and students were involved in war work of different kinds, including fighting, and about 240 staff and students were killed during the First World War, who are commemorated on various war memorials and so on. The college was very active in lots of different ways. At one stage there was a threat that the college buildings would be taken over by the War Department, but in fact they were so busy with all sorts of war work that clearly became not a good idea. In particular, the various laboratories were being used for war work. A group of staff and in fact students were involved in analysing samples of coal that were sent in for a substance called toluene, which was important for explosives, and they were analysing these samples of coal to find out how much toluene there was in them. And in particular there were a group of women at the King's College for Women still over in Kensington at that stage, organising courses in trench and camp cookery. This is for women who were being sent to the front to cook for the troops and for nurses in hospitals.
India makes a quite remarkable contribution to the war. Up to 1 million Indian troops serve during the First World War. The majority are drawn from the northern province of Punjab, and they serve with distinction in France and Flanders, but also in the Middle East against the Ottoman Empire.
4 million non-white people were drafted into the armies of France, Britain, Germany, and the United States during the First World War. But more seems to have been written on the 4 major British First World War poets than on these 4 million non-white people who served. And Eurocentrism is not the only fault, because most of these men were recruited from small villages. They were often poor people, and they were often non-literate. So these soldiers have not left us with the abundance of diaries, memoirs, poems, short stories that form the cornerstone of European First World War memory. Thus, in order to understand and excavate, and this is a word that I'd been using for some time, is this constant digging or excavating the colonial war experience, I think we need a different methodology. We need to go far beyond that of conventional archives. We need to go beyond just the written word.
On the 13th of April 1919, in a walled garden known as the Janianwala Bagh, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer fires into a crowd of protesters. In the ensuing 6 to 10 minutes of firing, up to 400 are killed and 1,000 are wounded. This is in response to 3 days of sustained rioting and disorders across northern India, and is really the result of an insecure and frightened officer operating without intelligence in a hostile city. The massacre, as it's known, the Amritsar massacre, becomes a touchstone for nationalist protest. This is what they say is the reality of imperial rule, nothing but repression. The truth is, it is more of a freak accident between an insecure officer who doesn't really know how to use crowd control techniques and who doesn't know what he's getting into. Nevertheless, the result is that the whole environment for political change and reform in India is completely derailed by this incident, which puts the nationalists and the British once more at each other's throats.
The crisis was prompted by an Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, which was taken by the markets to mean that there was going to be a war. That resulted in the universal scramble for cash. Everyone wanted to sell assets, everyone wanted to withdraw their deposits from banks. When that happens as a mass stampede, markets collapse and the banks collapse. So this was a major systemic issue. The authorities, led by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, reacted very promptly. They declared a 4-day bank holiday during which the banks were closed. The banks reopened on Friday the 7th of August, and there was no bank run. By averting the financial catastrophe, it made a serious contribution to the British war effort.
When people talk about the First World War nowadays, they're often interested in counterfactuals, in what might have been if the war hadn't happened or if it had turned out differently. And one of the great questions in the literature of the war is what would have happened had all the wonderful poets and writers who died so young in battle had survived. What might they have been capable of? Someone like Rupert Brooke, who was probably the best known British poet at the start of the war, who died of malaria on his way to fight. How would his writing have changed if he'd survived? Would he have turned from the rather sort of euphemistic Georgian style glorifying war to write something more realistic and that would have registered the experience of battle, the horrors of war that we're familiar with in the later war poetry of people like Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon?
Wilfred Owen is conventionally regarded as the patron saint of pity, and this is absolutely true. But at the same time, he is the only war poet who draws us time and again into extreme moments of sense experience. Moments, for example, when the limbs are knife-skewed, or when the mouth starts bleeding, or the shatter of flying muscles. And it's through a strange linguistic tactile fantasy. He almost seduces us into moments from which we would otherwise flinch from.
One of the curious questions about the war is the relation between modernism and war writing. Most of the best known war poets, for example, aren't really writing what you think of as modernist verse. The poetry of people like Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon is incredibly powerful and haunting. It's often quite dissonant. Owen's half-rhymes, for example, often introduce a kind of jarring note in the verse. But the verse forms are often very traditional still. He's still writing in sonnets or traditional verse stanzas. And similarly in the prose writing of the war, the famous memoirs by people like Siegfried Sassoon again, or Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, Edmund Blunden's very fine undertones of war, they're all, again, very powerful records, testimonies about the war. But the forms are still fairly conventional. They're straightforward chronological narratives for the most part. They're not difficult to read. They often have a sort of bitter irony, a lot of anger about what the writers have witnessed. But they aren't really works that you would think of as modernist. Poetry of the war has always been very political. A lot of the classic poems were seen as protest poems, and particularly in the 1960s and 70s, there was a sort of prevalent view of the war as what you might call, the lions led by donkeys approach, or the sort of thing that came across in the theatre production "Oh, What a Lovely War" that was later filmed as well, where what you see is the kind of idiocy of the war, the futility of it, the craziness of the whole sort of military campaign and the political strategies behind it. Whereas the current government clearly thinks that's not the way we should be approaching it, and that we should be sort of approaching it much more in terms of respect and sacrifice, and acknowledging the sort of contribution British soldiers made, and the effect that had on the shape of Europe.
100 years on, we'll re-engage with the centenary in a programme of events that's going to occupy society for 5 years. It causes one to wonder exactly why the First World War is still such a living event in our societies 100 years after it came to an end. Any of us don't have to look very far back in our family tree to encounter relatives who participated in that war, whether as combatants or playing a role on the home front. Many of us, of course, will have relatives antecedents who became casualties of this war, whose names are recorded on gravestones and war memorials. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of our history as individuals, of the history of our societies in the 20th century, and of the history of the world